Hi, I hope you're well. In this one I'm making a simple little plywood tool tote with a twist. The bottom tray can be left behind, or literally with a twist of the tote it can be picked up as part of the stack, and the whole thing fits into a t-loc sustainer as well. So this is based around an old plywood tool tote that I made back when I was first doing handyman work, but updated for the dimensions of the t-loc sustainers. The tote's really easy to make from just a quarter of a sheet of 9mm plywood, just glued and nailed together. This was my original one from close to 20 years ago. It wasn't made anything like as well as the new one, but it held up really well after daily use for about 15 years. So I've got no concerns whatsoever about how this one will hold up over time. But if you do, then obviously you should add whatever other fixings as you feel necessary. So you don't have to make it sustainer sized, but whatever you make, I suggest standardizing on a set size so they can be stacked together, mixed and matched however you like. Whatever you do use though, I'd recommend mucking up a baseboard out of a piece of scrap like this one, just to make sure that it fits nicely in the boxes that you plan to use. And if you do want to use the t-loc sustainer, then these are the maximum dimensions for a Sys 4, and there's a QR code there as well. If you want to get your hands on a set of plans, they should also be down in the product shelf directly below this video, or in my store at 10minute.shop. The tote is in 3 parts: the top tray, the body and the bottom tray, and each element is made up of a base, 2 sides and 2 ends, a standard box. The body has a handle fixed to the base, and the top tray has a slot that fits over this. The top tray sits directly on top of the tote body. The body sides extend to the ground, and the narrower bottom tray sits within these sides. And the idea behind that is that you might not always want the contents of the tray with you, or you might just have something loose in the bottom of the sustainer that you don't want. And the sides of the body, the legs if you like, would fit around whatever that is and still sit flat on the base. I want to say a big thank you to 10 Minute Workshop Plus member Peter K for that idea. At the ends of the top and bottom trays have an optional recessed finger pull, and as I said before, there's a simple wooden latching mechanism that allows the bottom tray to be lifted as part of the stack or left behind, depending on which way around the body is. I've used the cheapest 9mm Malaysian plywood I could get from my local timber yard, and I've got to say, aside from the usual wafer thin veneers, it's a really nice quality plywood. And at £30 a sheet, a quarter of a sheet that I used for this tote was just £7.50, less than $10. I made the handle out of a piece of birch plywood scrap. I used 12mm just for comfort, but 9mm will also work. So that's the 5 elements of each component and the 12mm handle all sorted. I just need to cut a slot in the top of the tray big enough for the handle to pass through and allow the boxes to stack. A router is the perfect tool for the job. You can also cut the slot by drilling a couple of holes and using something like a track saw to cut between them. If you are using a router, then for a centered slot like this, a good trick is to turn the work around once you've cut through and make another pass with a router just to make sure that it's central. The handheld cutout can be any shape you like, but I'm actually using a prototype of what will be the next 10 Minute Workshop product, the 10 Minute Workshop Multi-jig, and I'll chat a bit more about that later on. With the cutout finished, the edges of the handle were rounded over, again just for comfort. You can do this with a sander or with a router if you have one. I've marked and drilled through the base of the tote body, and I'd recommend centering the top tray base against this. And then I've used some sandpaper as shims just to make sure that the handle is centered in the slot. And then I can drill into the handle through the body base. And then just dry fit the screws just to make sure that everything locates well. I'm not going to fix the handle in position yet though, as the box is easier to put together without it. And just as a precaution, I'm marking the base and side of the handle with a piece of tape, just so that I know which way round it goes. I've added finger pull recesses in the ends of the top and bottom trays as I found them to be useful. These can be any shape you like, and again I'm using the prototype multi-jig, this time with a dovetail bit in the router, as the shape gives a convenient little lip to the recess. You'll also want some thin strips of material to make the latching mechanism. In my prototype I just used waxing sticks that I sanded into a wedge shape, and they worked well. But if you have the means, I'd recommend something a little more hard wearing, especially if you expect to use it a lot. I use some strips of reclaimed oak floorboards for mine. So with all the components cut and all the machining complete, we can start construction. As I mentioned before, the whole tote is simply glued and nailed together with 18 gauge nails. For the top tray, I've added a clamp to the spare side to use for balance, then glued and pinned through the base and into the other side. I fitted the ends onto the side and base next, making sure the finger pull recesses are facing outwards, obviously. And again, just glued and pinned through the base and side into the end. And then the remaining side is fitted in the same way. For the tote body, I'm fitting both ends to the base first, then offering up the sides and marking the centre of the base along both sides so I know where to nail through. And while the glue sets, I've added a weight onto this just to be sure that it dries flat and true. And finally the bottom tray. Ends onto the base first, finger pulls facing out of course, and then you fit the sides in the same way. While the glue goes off, I'm ripping those thin wedge-shaped strips of oak for the latching mechanism. Around a 5-degree bevel worked well for this thickness of board, and the thick end of the wedge was around 1.5 to 2 millimeters, the 1/16 of an inch or so. You'll need 6 of these pieces, and the size doesn't really matter as long as they're less than 1/3 of the length of the boxed side. Mine were about 100 millimeters, 4 inches or so. With the glue all set, this is a good time to give everything a rub down with some P120 abrasive to clean up the glue lines. And once that's done, I can fit the handle to the base of the body using the screw holes that I made earlier, this time adding a dab of glue in there as well as the 3.5 by 30 millimeter screws. And it's always worth checking that the top tray fits nicely over the handle before the glue sets. Don't ask me how I know that. So latch mechanism next, and this really is very simple. On the inside of one leg of the body, we glue 2 of the wedge-shaped strips we cut earlier, 1 at each end, with the thin end of the bevel facing down. On the inside of the opposite leg, we glue 1 wedge-shaped strip in the centre, again thin edge down. And we repeat this on the opposite sides of the bottom tray, but this time with the thin edge of the bevel facing upwards and the strips positioned slightly higher up the sides of the tray than the width of the strips themselves. I'm using a test cut of the oak floorboard as a gauge. This small gap, a millimetre, is plenty. Just make sure that the bottom tray slides out easily when the tote is placed on a flat surface. By the way, if you're using these little spring clamps on the strips, make sure that they don't move under pressure, as you really do need them to be in the right place. So while the glue set's on those, let me give you a quick tour of the 10-minute workshop multi-jig. This is just a working prototype. I'm getting the first production sample in very soon, but basically whenever I use my handle cutout template, the little plywood one in a video, I used it most recently for the oak drawer fronts. I always get questions about it. They're easy enough to make, but you do need a large hole saw, so they're not for everyone, and certainly not worth buying a large hole saw just to make a template. Anyway, I knew that I needed to make the handle cutout for this tote and the recesses, the finger pulls for the ends of the boxes, so it seemed like a good idea to combine them into a simple router template that uses a 30mm guide bush and a 1/2 inch or 12 or 13mm bit. Of course, not all handles are cut out. You also have bar handles as well, and this jig also has positions for handles at 160mm centers, 128, 64mm and 96mm as well. Of course, it would be silly not to add one in between the 128 and 64mm and set them back 37mm from the edge, so you also have a run of shelf burn holes in there as well. 96mm is familiar as well, isn't it? Yeah, as we saw in the recent Tracksaw Launchpad video, one of the ways to extend the crosscut on an MFT top is to bore an offset hole in the top between the columns of holes, and as well as extending the crosscut, this also puts the cut line between the column of holes as well. The jig also does something similar for that Wolfcraft MFT-alike bench that I looked at recently, and there'll be more to come on that in the next video. There's more things to come on this too. There's a simple concealed hinge and hinge plate marking positions using an awl, and there'll be reference pins for this like that are on the loose-handed jig. As I say, this is just a first look at a working prototype, an introduction, if you like, of what's coming along shortly. And if this sounds like something you might be interested in, then you can register an interest at 10minutejigs.com. There's no money changing hands or anything like that. You just put your name down to be informed about costs and availability of the different bundles in advance of these being public knowledge. So if that tickles your fancy, then head on over to 10minutejigs.com, pop your name down, and I'll be in touch very soon. So that's all looking pretty good, and at the risk of stating the obvious, when the body is turned one way, the wedges catch against each other, and when it's turned the other, they're allowed to pass freely. They don't connect at all. You might need to fine tune the wedges with a little bit of sanding. Just don't do what I did and sand away too much, as you'll have to replace the strip, as I learned the hard way. One thing I have done on this is to add some little corner feet to the underside of the top tray, just to make sure it locates nicely. And you can do that to any additional trays or boxes that you might want as well, just to make them stack that little bit better. There is a little bit more space in the sustainer if you want a slightly taller handle. I kept this one within the height of the top tray to make them easier to stack, but obviously those are things you can change to suit your needs, just like the size of the individual trays. I made the top one slightly taller because I knew that was the one that I'd want to access most, but I think that's worked out really nicely actually. It is such a simple little thing, but very satisfying to do. It doesn't need a big toolkit to do it. I've used all the bits and pieces that I've got at my disposal, because why wouldn't I? But I made the original one, wherever it is. I made this one with just a track saw and a stapler, because that's all I had. And as I say, I was used hard every day for best part of 15 years and is still working just fine, although I think the current one is a better design. Let me know what you think in the comments down below, and be sure to pick up a set of plans at 10minute.shop or directly below this video on the product shelf. But I'll call this one done for this week. Thanks so much for taking a look. Be sure to join me in the next one when I'll have the 3 cheap and easy fixes for that Wolfcraft MFT-alike bench that I looked at recently. Those 3 easy fixes make it so much more usable, so cheap and easy that Wolfcraft really should be doing it themselves. But I'll call this one done for now. Thanks so much for stopping by. I will see you again very soon. Right, take care.